In the deep, shadowed heart of 19th-century Kentucky, where the mist clung to the fields and blood stained the soil of old plantations, one story still refuses to die. It's whispered not in history books but in the terrified hush of old families who swore to never speak her name again. They said she came from the quarters, that her eyes burned like embers when the moon rose, and that vengeance rode in her breath. What happened one humid summer night of 1851 would leave a mark no one could wash away, not even time. The story of Harriet of Kentucky begins in the slow suffocation of the southern summer, when the air grew so thick it could choke the breath out of a man, and the cries of the enslaved were drowned by cicadas. Harriet was one of those voices buried beneath sweat and obedience, a woman born into bondage on a plantation that treated mercy as weakness. Her days bled into one another, an endless cycle of toil, hunger, and silent endurance. Yet even as she bent beneath the weight of her owner's demands, there was something in her eyes that no whip could extinguish. It was not defiance in its loud, foolish form, but a quiet, simmering awareness, a knowledge that every act of cruelty carved its place in memory, waiting to be answered in kind. She watched, she endured, and beneath her skin, vengeance began to breathe. The plantation itself was a world of hypocrisy wrapped in fine manners. The masters spoke of faith, yet their hands built altars out of blood. The overseer, a man named Marshall, was known for his cruelty. His whip sang louder than the church bells on Sunday mornings, and his punishments were often more creative than necessary. Harriet learned early that to draw his attention was to invite suffering, so she worked in silence, her back scarred but her mind sharp. She had been separated from her mother as a child, sold to the Kentucky estate after a failed escape attempt by her kin. Since then, she had learned how to become invisible, how to lower her gaze while never ceasing to see. Years passed beneath that mask of obedience until the arrival of Marshall's new bride, a woman of youth and beauty named Eleanor. She came from the city, carrying perfume and arrogance, her skin untouched by sun or work. To her, the plantation was a place of charm and power, a stage where she could command admiration and fear in equal measure. From the first day she arrived, she treated Harriet not as human, but as a curiosity, something exotic and disposable. Harriet was assigned as her personal maid, forced to brush her hair, clean her gowns, and serve her tea as if the distance between them were ordained by God himself. Eleanor's cruelty was delicate, refined. She did not strike with a whip, but with words, gestures, and small humiliations that cut deeper than lashes. There were moments when Harriet could feel her rage coil beneath her skin, moments when she imagined tearing that fine silk from Eleanor's body and showing her what real suffering looked like. But she did not act, not yet. She listened as the overseer and his bride mocked the enslaved, as they laughed at the cries from the fields. She watched the way Eleanor looked at the overseer's whip with fascination rather than fear, the way she leaned against him as he boasted of how obedience was bred through pain. Harriet said nothing, though the nights grew longer and the dreams darker. She began to see her mother's face again, the face of the woman taken away, the woman who whispered before she vanished that no pain lasts forever, that one day the blood debt would be paid. The plantation had its own heartbeat, one that pulsed with secrets and suffering. The enslaved whispered about the woods at night, about things that moved when no one was watching. They said spirits lingered among the trees, waiting for justice denied to them in life. Harriet listened. She began leaving small offerings at the edge of the forest, scraps of food, drops of her own blood, words she could not speak aloud. Whether it was faith, madness, or something older than either, she felt something stir in return. The wind would shift when she stood alone in the dark, and sometimes she could swear she heard whispers echo her thoughts. It was then that she stopped fearing death and began preparing for something else. The turning point came one afternoon when Eleanor, in her vanity, ordered Harriet to fetch a mirror from the attic. The attic was filled with relics of the past, trunks of forgotten clothes, portraits of dead ancestors, and one thing Harriet had never seen before, a journal, half burned, its pages filled with ink that spoke of old rituals and the blood of the enslaved used to bless the harvest. She realized then that the plantation's wealth was not built merely on labor, but on offerings, on sacrifices cloaked in prayer. The cruelty of the living was fed by the suffering of the dead. Harriet carried the journal back to her quarters, her heart pounding with both dread and revelation. She began reading it by candlelight, piecing together the words that had been meant to remain buried. Each night after, her mind sharpened, her purpose grew clearer. The overseer's bride had to be made to understand what it meant to feel powerless, what it meant to be stripped of dignity, to have one's flesh turned into a warning. Harriet's anger ceased to be emotion and became devotion, a holy fire kindled in the bones of the broken. The more Eleanor humiliated her, the more Harriet's resolve solidified, until vengeance no longer felt like choice, but destiny. She started collecting small tools from the laundry, bits of metal, pieces of wire, a needle here, a shard there. No one noticed, no one cared. She was invisible again, and invisibility was her greatest weapon. The days leading up to the summer feast were heavy with storm clouds and tension. The plantation prepared for a celebration of wealth and power, while in the shadows, something older waited to be unleashed. Harriet moved through her tasks with a strange calm, her silence now masking a storm too vast to contain. The overseer's whip still cracked, Eleanor still smirked, and the laughter of the white guests still floated through the air like poisoned perfume. But beneath it all, beneath the music and the cruelty, there was an invisible pulse, a rhythm only Harriet could feel. The time was coming, and when it did, the soil of Kentucky would drink deep, and the name Harriet would no longer belong to a slave, but to a legend whispered in fear for generations to come. The overseer, Marshall, was not born cruel, or at least that's what he told himself when he stood before the mirror in the early dawn, buttoning his vest and tying his boots. But cruelty has a way of growing like ivy, wrapping itself around a man until it becomes his nature. By the time Harriet had come to know him, the man's eyes had turned flat, like the surface of a still pond that hid rot beneath. He had long stopped seeing those who labored in the fields as people. To him, they were parts of a machine, tools to be broken and replaced. His whip was his tongue, his authority his religion, and his power his addiction. He found satisfaction not merely in obedience, but in the spectacle of pain, in watching fear ripple through the quarters like wind through the corn. He was a man who needed the world to tremble at his presence, and the only ones who did not were those who no longer lived to remember him. When his first wife died of fever, the plantation grew quieter for a while, but even grief could not soften him. The new bride he brought home months later, Eleanor, was nothing like the woman who had died. Eleanor was young, pretty, and cruel in the way only those untouched by hardship could be. She had grown up in the city, in drawing rooms and parlors, hearing stories about plantations and wealth, but never about the blood that built them. To her, the South was romantic: magnolias, tea, white dresses, and gentlemen who commanded the land. She found the reality thrilling in a way that only the protected could. She saw the enslaved not as people, but as ornaments in a grand story she had just stepped into. When she saw Marshall's whip for the first time, she didn't recoil. She smiled, her lips curving in fascination as he told her how he kept order. It was in that moment that Harriet understood she was dealing not just with another master's wife, but with someone who took pleasure in the power to harm. The plantation began to change under Eleanor's presence. She wanted refinement, elegance, and cruelty wrapped in silk. The punishments became public, not for discipline but for amusement. The fields echoed with screams, and at night, laughter floated from the mansion. Harriet, who served in the house, saw everything. She was forced to stand near the doorway as Marshall bragged to guests about how his bride could harden her heart faster than any man. She heard Eleanor mock the enslaved, heard her say that fear kept them in line better than food. Harriet's hands would tremble when she washed Eleanor's dresses, still faintly stained with blood from her husband's whip. Eleanor's fascination with power soon became an obsession. She began visiting the quarters during daylight, trailing lace and perfume, watching the workers with detached curiosity. She once asked Harriet to bring her to the whipping post, claiming she wanted to see how discipline was carried out. Harriet had no choice but to obey. She stood behind her mistress as Marshall demonstrated his technique on a man accused of stealing cornmeal. Eleanor's eyes gleamed in the sun. She didn't flinch when the whip cracked. She leaned forward, studying each lash as if it were art. The man's cries faded, and Harriet felt her stomach twist into knots. When Eleanor finally turned to her and whispered that the overseer's hand was steady because he cared for her approval, Harriet realized something far darker was taking shape between them. They were feeding each other's sickness, his cruelty, her delight, and every drop of blood spilled on that land became part of their bond. The evenings grew stranger. Harriet would sometimes hear laughter from the mansion at midnight, followed by the soft hum of music and the echo of heavy boots. The servants spoke of shadows that moved past the windows, of Eleanor dancing barefoot on the veranda, while Marshall's whip lay coiled beside her. The overseer's cruelty deepened, his punishments more vicious, his orders more unpredictable. Harriet began to feel that something had changed within him since Eleanor's arrival, that she had unlocked a part of him he had tried to bury. He became cruel not just for control, but for her attention. Each scream was an offering. Each bruise was proof of devotion. For the enslaved, the arrival of Eleanor marked the end of what little peace they had. The quarters were filled with fear, the kind that silences even children's cries at night. Harriet watched the young and old alike break under the overseer's temper, and she realized that the only difference between him and his wife was the way they expressed their power. His was raw and violent, hers was precise and psychological. She would insult, humiliate, and demand the impossible. She would wake Harriet in the middle of the night just to have her lace a corset or clean a pair of shoes that weren't even dirty. She'd tell her she smelled of dirt, that her eyes were too proud, that her silence was insolence. Harriet learned to nod, to apologize, to bow, but inside her, a furnace burned hotter every day. Eleanor began to grow bolder. There were times she'd take the whip herself, laughing as Marshall guided her hand. The others would look away, unable to bear witness. Harriet never forgot the sound of that laughter, the high, ringing tone of it that didn't belong to a human heart. It was that sound that haunted her, that kept her awake when the night fell too quiet. She began to pray again, but her prayers were no longer for salvation. They were for balance, for the return of what had been taken. The overseer's cruelty became legend, but it was Eleanor's quiet malice that carved itself deepest into Harriet's soul. Every humiliation, every cruel order, every time she was made to kneel in the dirt or clean blood from the veranda steps, added weight to a scale that would one day tip. Harriet could see it in her dreams, the day when the cries would change direction, when the whip would be silent, and the screams would belong to those who had never known what it meant to be helpless. The air around her seemed to thicken, as if the land itself waited for that reckoning. The sky stayed heavy with storms that never broke, and the nights carried whispers that curled through the cane fields. Something was coming. Harriet didn't know when, but she knew the overseer and his bride had already written their own ending with every act of cruelty they celebrated beneath the moon. The night of vengeance began like any other on the plantation, humid and restless, with the air thick enough to drown in. Lanterns hung from the veranda as music drifted from the great house, where Marshall and Eleanor were hosting their midsummer gathering. The wealthy neighbors came dressed in linen and lace, fanning themselves while sipping whiskey, speaking of crops and politics, never acknowledging the hands that grew the food or built the walls around them. The enslaved moved like shadows in the background, silent, unseen, their eyes lowered, but their minds alive with things they could never speak. Among them, Harriet served drinks, her hands steady, her face calm, her heart a slow, pounding drum beneath her ribs. None could tell that behind her stillness lay the storm that had been building for years. The overseer's laughter rang through the hall, sharp and coarse. Eleanor, radiant in her white gown, stood beside him like a queen of cruelty, her jewels glinting in the candlelight. Her gaze fell on Harriet more than once that night, a smirk curling at the corner of her mouth, a small reminder of ownership. Harriet had spent the day preparing for this evening, each motion measured, each step part of a rhythm that only she knew. The night was her cathedral, and vengeance was her gospel. She had hidden what she needed where no one would look, in the laundry room, beneath the boards of the smokehouse, and in the folds of her own clothes. As the celebration grew louder, she moved quietly through the corridors, her bare feet barely whispering against the wood. She had studied the mansion's layout for years, memorized its creaks, its drafts, its blind corners. The guests laughed, toasts were made, and above it all, Eleanor's voice carried like silk, dipped in poison. Harriet heard it from the hallway and felt the weight of all her years of silence pressing against her chest. The moment had come, but she did not rush. Vengeance, to be righteous, must be patient. She waited until the guests began to drift toward the veranda, until the music grew louder to cover what was about to happen. Eleanor excused herself from the gathering, her delicate hands brushing against her husband's arm before she glided down the hallway toward her dressing room. Harriet was already waiting there in the dark, her presence hidden behind the door. The air smelled of rosewater and powder, but underneath it lingered the faint trace of blood, a scent that never truly left the plantation. Harriet's breathing slowed as Eleanor entered, humming softly to herself, unaware that she was not alone. The door clicked shut, and for the first time, the house fell away, leaving only two women, one born to rule, the other born to suffer, standing in the same space of silence that would soon be broken by something far more primal. Eleanor turned toward her mirror, admiring her reflection, her fingers touching her throat where her necklace lay like a chain of gold. Harriet stepped forward, and in that instant, something ancient moved through her. Not rage, not madness, but a cold, deliberate power. The same hands that had served tea and washed floors now reached for the blade hidden beneath her apron. The moment their eyes met, Eleanor's smile faltered. There was a flicker of confusion, then fear, but it came too late. The years of cruelty, the laughter at the pain of others, the way she had made Harriet kneel and beg, all of it condensed into that single heartbeat before the blade found flesh. The sound that followed was not a scream at first, but a gasp, the sound of realization. Harriet's movements were slow, methodical, guided by something beyond fury. The door locked behind them with a dull click, the music outside drowning the faint sounds within. The blade's path was sure, not clumsy or wild, and Eleanor's beauty, so admired and envied, began to peel away like the mask it truly was. Harriet's hands did not tremble. She had long since lost the luxury of mercy. Every stroke was a memory. Her mother's cries, the lash that tore her back, the laughter that followed her humiliation. Eleanor's screams rose then, sharp and desperate, but the walls of the house were thick, and outside the guests mistook the sound for merriment. By the time the noise subsided, the white gown was red, the perfume turned sour, and the floor glistened beneath the lantern light. Harriet stood over what remained, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the body before her, as though seeing not Eleanor, but the ghost of every master, every overseer, every hand that had ever broken another's will. She reached down and touched the blood with her fingertips, smearing it across her face like a mark of freedom, like paint for a new kind of war. The air in the room was heavy, almost sacred. The walls seemed to breathe with her, the shadows seemed to bow. When she stepped outside, she did not run. She walked through the hallway, leaving crimson footprints on the polished floor. The guests were still laughing, still drinking, still blind. The first to notice her was one of the housemaids, who dropped her tray when she saw the blood and the calm in Harriet's eyes. The scream that followed shattered the illusion of order that had held the plantation together for so long. The music stopped. The laughter died. Marshall turned, his face pale, as Harriet stood at the top of the stairs, her hands still slick, her expression unchanging. For a moment, no one moved, the entire room suspended between horror and disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Men shouted, chairs overturned, and Marshall's roar filled the air as he charged toward her. But Harriet didn't flinch. Her task was done. The overseer's bride, his symbol of pride and power, lay stripped of her beauty, her humanity, and her supremacy. The blood on Harriet's hands was not just vengeance. It was the breaking of a cycle, the voice of the voiceless, the scream of centuries released in one night. Outside, thunder rumbled, as if the heavens themselves had been waiting to bear witness. The plantation that had thrived on the silence of the oppressed now trembled with the sound of its own undoing. As the storm broke and rain began to fall, the blood on the grass ran in small, dark streams, seeping into the soil that had known only suffering. Harriet did not resist when they seized her. She did not beg. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, her expression unyielding, her lips moving in a whisper no one could hear. The night had swallowed the overseer's laughter, the bride's cruelty, and the illusion of control that had ruled that land for generations, leaving only the echo of a single act that would never be forgotten. A night when one woman's silence became the voice of all who had been forced to bow. They said the screams that rose from the plantation that night could be heard clear across the valley, echoing through the cypress trees, like the wail of something not entirely human. The guests fled from the mansion in terror, their carriages rolling down the muddy road as thunder cracked over the fields. The storm that had been gathering for weeks finally broke open, and rain poured onto the estate as if the heavens themselves had decided to cleanse it. But the blood was too much to wash away. It ran down the steps of the grand house, mingling with the water, turning the white gravel path into a dark river that soaked into the lawn. The overseer's bride lay where Harriet had left her, and the overseer himself knelt beside her, his face pale, his hands trembling, the great beast of the plantation reduced to a broken man before the corpse of the woman he'd once boasted about owning as much as his slaves. The guests whispered later that what they saw when the door burst open was something unholy. They said Harriet stood in the hall, drenched in blood and rain, her eyes gleaming like a flame that refused to die. Some claimed she was smiling, others swore she wept. But everyone agreed that there was a calm about her, the kind that didn't belong to this world. Marshall lunged for her, driven by fury and madness, but his strength faltered when she met his gaze. He saw in her eyes something that no man could conquer, a reckoning far older than him. It was said that he hesitated for just a breath, that the whip slipped from his hand, that he looked not at a woman but at an omen. And in that heartbeat, the balance of power that had ruled the plantation for decades collapsed like a rotten beam under its own weight. Outside, the field hands gathered, drawn by the chaos, by the sound of rain and screams, by something in the air that felt like the end of all things. They stood at the edge of the yard, staring through the downpour at the house that had been their prison. The overseer's voice broke through the storm, cursing Harriet, calling her a demon, a monster, an abomination. But the words sounded small, powerless, swallowed by the wind. Harriet stood motionless, her face lifted toward the sky, her hands open as if offering the blood that covered her to the storm. Some said lightning struck then, so close that the air split and the trees shuddered. Others said the ground itself trembled beneath their feet. The overseer shouted for the men to seize her, but none moved. Not one dared step forward. The power that had always held them, the fear that had kept them chained, seemed to dissolve in that moment. Harriet had done what none had dared imagine. She had turned the world upside down, if only for a breath. The rain grew heavier, washing the blood from her arms, streaking her face like war paint. The overseer finally lunged, his knife drawn, his fury blind. The men watched as the two collided in the mud, and the thunder roared above them. Some said Harriet did not fight to live, only to make him bleed, to make him feel what she had carried all those years. Others swore that as he struck her, the wind howled so loud it drowned his curses. And when it was over, he fell beside her, his face twisted in horror, his eyes wide as if seeing something behind her, something he couldn't name. When the storm passed and dawn crept over the horizon, the overseer was found dead, his throat torn open, though no blade lay near his body. Harriet's own body was battered, her breath shallow, her skin cold. But even then, the expression on her face was not of pain. It was peace. By morning, the plantation was silent. The mansion's windows were shattered, the lawn torn and trampled, the house servants huddled together in shock. The guests were gone, leaving only wreckage behind. The local sheriff arrived later that day, summoned by frantic whispers of murder and witchcraft. They found Harriet sitting in the mud near the body of the overseer's bride, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant. She didn't resist when they bound her wrists. She didn't speak when they asked why. They said she looked at them the way a dying animal might look at its hunter, not with fear, but with the strange understanding that something larger than both had already decided the outcome. The law moved quickly in those days when it came to slaves who rose against their masters. They called her a savage, a creature possessed, a warning to others. No one spoke of the years of abuse, the humiliation, the whip. No one mentioned the laughter that had followed every lash, or the way Eleanor's hands had trembled in excitement when the punishments began. They wanted a story of horror, not justice, and they got it. Within days, word spread across counties, the tale of the slave woman who skinned her mistress alive. People came from miles to see the place where it happened, to stare at the mansion that still smelled of blood and storm. They said the grass would never grow again where Eleanor fell. The execution was held beneath the old oak on the edge of the property, the same tree where others had been hung for lesser defiance. The air was heavy that day, the crowd restless. Harriet was led barefoot through the field, her white shift torn, her eyes still calm. Witnesses would later whisper that when they placed the noose around her neck, the sky darkened again, though the morning had been clear. The preacher read his verses, but his voice shook. When they asked if she had any final words, she simply raised her head and looked toward the mansion, toward the veranda where the overseer and his bride once stood to watch others suffer. Her silence was her answer. When the trapdoor fell and her body swung, a gust of wind tore through the trees, strong enough to scatter the hats from men's heads and snuff out lanterns. Some fell to their knees, believing they had seen the wrath of God. After that day, the plantation began to decay. The overseer's mansion never hosted another gathering. The walls peeled, the windows cracked, and the once bright columns turned gray with mildew. Families who later tried to live there spoke of whispers in the night, of a woman's cry carried on the wind, of footsteps pacing the lawn when the moon was full. The workers refused to go near the oak where Harriet was hung, saying that blood still seeped from its roots after heavy rain. Even the animals avoided the field where Eleanor died. The land had drunk too much pain, and it would not yield peace again. The people who had once ruled it with laughter and cruelty were gone, their names fading from memory. But the story of the woman who turned her suffering into retribution remained, told in hushed tones wherever the wind moved through the pines. They said that after Harriet's body was taken down, the air around the plantation changed forever. The land never settled back into silence. The crows came first, blackening the sky above the fields, their cries echoing over the empty veranda where the overseer's laughter had once ruled. The workers who remained whispered that the earth had taken her spirit, that she had refused to rest, that her soul had mingled with the mud and blood that soaked the roots of the Kentucky pines. For nights after her death, strange sounds carried through the fields, low murmurs that rose and fell with the wind, like prayers whispered by unseen mouths. The mansion, which once stood proud, began to rot from the inside out. Floorboards warped, wallpaper peeled. The great staircase that had gleamed beneath Eleanor's delicate feet now groaned beneath the weight of ghosts. The new owners tried to cleanse it, to scrub away the stain of what had been done. Preachers came, sprinkling holy water on the walls, reading from their books, as if words alone could silence what had awakened. But no matter how many times the sermons were spoken, the house would not quiet. Servants fled in the night, claiming they heard footsteps pacing through the halls when no one was there, or saw a shadow lingering by the mirror in Eleanor's old dressing room. They spoke of a figure standing in the rain, her face streaked with red, her eyes hollow and burning at once. Some swore that when they turned to look directly at her, she vanished, leaving only the faint scent of iron and smoke. The ones who stayed long enough learned not to look toward the windows after dark. They said she watched from there, her reflection flickering in the glass like a memory refusing to fade. Years passed, and the plantation's name became a warning whispered to travelers who passed along the old road. Children dared each other to run up to the gate at night, to touch the iron fence and listen for the faint hum that vibrated through it, like a pulse buried deep in the metal. Old folks sitting by fires spoke of the curse Harriet had left behind. They said the rain that fell on that soil never washed clean, that it carried the taste of rust, that the crops that grew there came up twisted and dark. Some even claimed to have seen her, walking across the fields at dusk, her silhouette limned in the glow of lightning, dragging her shadow behind her like a chain. The bravest men who went searching for her ghost swore they heard her whisper in the dark, not in rage, but in warning, as though the land itself demanded silence and remembrance. By the time the Civil War swept across the South, the plantation stood abandoned. The columns cracked, the roof sagged, and vines climbed over the doors like green veins. Soldiers who passed through the area refused to camp nearby, saying the ground made their horses uneasy. Those who ignored the warnings rarely slept. They woke drenched in sweat, convinced they heard crying from the tree line. A few never woke at all, their comrades finding them cold and stiff by morning, their eyes wide open, fixed on something no one else could see. The locals said Harriet's curse was not vengeance but balance, that the pain she had suffered and the blood she had spilled had opened something in that place that would never close again. Even as the years turned and the world changed, the legend refused to die. In the small towns around the valley, the elders told the story on humid nights when the moon was full, their voices low, their faces lit by flickering lamps. They told of a woman who rose from silence and gave her suffering back to those who had earned it. They said she did not die at the end of that rope, that when her body fell still, the earth took her in, claimed her as one of its own. The tree where she was hanged split down the middle decades later, lightning striking it during another storm. Half of it burned, but the other half lived on, gnarled and blackened, as if refusing to let go. Farmers who cut through the land avoided that spot, muttering that it hummed underfoot, that their tools grew heavy when they passed near. Generations later, when the plantation finally collapsed into ruin, people came searching for what was left. Some were historians, some thrill seekers, others simply drawn by the weight of the story. They picked through the debris of the house, finding scraps of porcelain, shards of glass, and bits of rusted metal. But it wasn't the relics that stayed with them. It was the feeling, that suffocating pressure that made their hearts race and their skin crawl. Some said the air itself was alive there, thick and electric. Cameras failed, compasses spun, and voices on recordings whispered names that no one had spoken in a century. Those who dared to stay past sunset described hearing chains dragging across the floors, faint singing from the fields, and the rhythmic sound of something beating like a heart beneath the soil. Legends say that every year, on the night of the midsummer storm, the air around the plantation grows warm and still, the crickets go silent, and a low mist rises from the ground. Locals claim that if you stand near the old oak, you can see her figure emerging through the fog, walking across the grass where Eleanor's blood had once run. They say she moves slowly, her gown flowing like smoke, her face half lit by the moon, her hands stained as if the years had never touched them. Those who have seen her say she does not frighten them but commands silence, as though demanding that the living remember what was buried in the soil beneath their feet. Over time, Harriet's name became legend, a ghost story, a warning. But in the deeper telling, among those whose ancestors knew the truth, she was not spoken of as a monster. She was a reckoning, a reminder that pain leaves echoes, that cruelty sows what it will one day reap. They said the cries heard in the wind were not the screams of the dead, but the songs of the freed, the ones who had waited in the dark for someone brave enough to answer. Even now, when the storms roll across Kentucky and lightning splits the sky, the people who live near the valley light candles in their windows, not out of fear, but respect. They say the thunder is her voice, calling through the centuries, reminding the world that some spirits never rest because their stories were never finished, that the land itself still trembles beneath the memory of Harriet, whose vengeance turned the soil to blood and whose name the night will never forget.